So we're doing Iggeres Hakodesh Tezvav, the 15th of the Alter Rebbe's letters. And last week we started it, and we essentially learned only the introduction. This week we're continuing it. And obviously tonight's class has an enormous amount to do with last week's class. So I'm going to try as quickly as I can to review some of the points that we talked about last week as the stage setters for tonight's class. This Iggeres Hakodesh, this particular letter, is certainly a letter about Kabbalah. There's no question about it. There's no tzedakah in this particular letter. I mean, it's tzedakah everywhere, but this particular letter, at least, it's not explicit. It's a letter about Kabbalah. And I explained to you last week that you could summarize Kabbalah in one word and then in two words. In other words, one more encompassing term and two aspects that add up to that initial point. And that is, you can summarize the whole purpose, vision, idea, contribution of Kabbalah with the word elokus, godliness. We talked about this at length last week. Godliness is not God. But godliness is not a creation. It's an expression of God. The reason godliness is so important is not only for its philosophical value, but because of its practical value. The argument is, it's impossible to know God. You can't be intimate with God. God's unknowable, because his existence is called non-existential. We talked about that at length last week. But godliness you can know, because godliness is, amongst other things, the concept of light, and light means access, availability. So the one word that would summarize Kabbalah would be the word godliness. The more specific definition, in other words, if you wanted to use two terms to define Kabbalah, the first would be Ein Sof, and the other would be Adam Ha'elyon. Ein Sof means infinite plainness, the so-called light of God, and in last week's class we called it Ma'oi, the infinity of godliness. Not the infinity of God, the infinity of godliness. And Adam, the anthropomorphic model, the notion that when God created his world, he created a blueprint. That blueprint conforms to the model, to the design of Adam, of so-called man, and everything is created in that image. That Adam is the inverse, is the opposite of Ein Sof. And the Hebrew terms that we used, because they work very well by contrast, is Ma'oid versus Adam. Ma'oid and Adam are the same Hebrew letters. Mem, Aleph, Dal, Mem. It's simply different in arrangement. Ma'oid means simple infinity, and Adam means complex and order. And the issue that we talked about last week with considerable detail is that Adam is as infinite as Ma'oid. The anthropomorphic model is as infinite as the simple and plain infinity. But the infinity is not in the plainness. The infinity is in the order and the integration and the unity. As I explained it to you last week, when you examine a living thing, it's made up of many parts. And those parts are made up of smaller parts and smaller parts and smaller parts. From the perspective of mysticism, it goes on ad infinitum. And on every layer and on every level, there has to be perfect order. If there's perfect order on every level, that's health. As we discussed last week, the effect of the original sin of Adam and Eve eating from the tree of knowledge of good and evil was that the smallest measure of inexactitude, of imperfection, was incorporated into the human being, and that's the beginning of death. So mysticism, Kabbalah says there is an Adam which is real, which is forever, because it's healthy, it's perfect. So you don't have infinity in its expansiveness, you don't have an infinity in its power, you have infinity in its order. And that's really, it's funny to say that you can summarize all Kabbalah in 4 minutes and 26 seconds, but it is a very succinct summary of everything Kabbalah talks about. Ein Sof and Adam, the infinite plainness of the so-called light of God and the anthropomorphic model, which what everybody knows about Kabbalah. What is it about Adam, about the human form, the anthropomorphic model, that is so ideal, that is so special, so distinctive? So in short, it is top, middle, bottom, right, left, center, as opposed to other beings that are horizontal and so forth and so on, or polar, one single pole, only one emotion, and so forth and so on. A human being has a mind which is higher than his heart and higher than the lower third of his body, the more instinctive responses, which have to do with what they call the older part of the brain. And at the same time, a human being has the capacity to feel every emotion, from the extreme of kindness, the extreme of cruelty, and everything in between. In other words, we're complete, we're whole. And, at least in theory, there's a balance. And that's why the human being is called in the image of God, although everything is an image of God, but all other things are in the image of God that's in some way or another distorted, compromised, entangled, messed up. This is the second point I talked about last week. The first point I talked about last week was the idea of allegory, metaphor. When you're learning Kabbalah, all you can do is use misholim, metaphor, allegory. You're talking about something mystical. Mystical means acharei hateva, metaphysical. It's not physical. And consequently, there's no way you can identify directly. You've never met Ein Sof, you've never met Adam Elyon. These are all ideas. And if we're going to relate to those ideas, we have to use examples, illustrations, from things that are familiar. So all of Kabbalah really is Mashal Amlitza. That's what it's about. It's using allegory, using metaphor to enlighten mystical concepts. And of course, the risk that we run in using metaphor in explaining mystical concepts is that the mystical concepts can become the metaphor. In other words, when you use something physical to explain something metaphysical, something mystical, you can materialize, you can be magashem, you can make corporeal, physical, something which isn't physical at all. And as I mentioned to you last week, this is one of those unknowns. The Baal Shem Tov said, the great Baal Shem Tov, who was all about mysticism, says, don't study Kabbalah, because you'll make God material. You'll make God physical. And there's a message in this. The message is that it's so important not to simplify concepts that are truly abstract and very fine, and you study them and you study them and you study them, and it's very, very important to be sensitive not to bring those concepts into our sphere, but try to raise ourselves into the sphere where those concepts exist. This is more or less a summary of last week's class. The pasuk, the phrase that was quoted last week, which is useful to us, is Mibisari echazer leka. I'll say it in Hebrew for you, yeah? Mibisari echazer leka. From my flesh I can know godliness. And there's much discussion in Hasidus on that pasuk, and it means essentially that since man was created in the image of God, you can extrapolate. You can know from man what can be known about God. And as we discussed last week, the concept of Nishtal Shalom Mehem, it's called the Mashal Mechuvan. The analogy is precise because actually we are in the image of God. So by studying ourselves, we're studying, in effect, how we are a mirror of something transcendent, something higher. Which leads us to tonight's class. Tonight's class, so let me tell you how this works. This is an essay from the Alter Rebbe. It's 6 pages long, 6 sides, and I've seen that it's been published in many books, including non-Chabad books. A lot of people publish this essay, they don't even know it's from the Alter Rebbe. They attribute it to all kinds of other people. And the first third of the essay is an introduction. And the introduction is what we did last week. The second 2/3 of the essay are an expose, they're in a presentation of the Esesphiros, the 10 divine attributes. What's interesting about it is that the Alter Rebbe doesn't really talk about the Esesphiros. He talks about the person. His intent, the purpose of writing this letter is to give you a sense of what the 10 spheres are, what Adam Ha'elim, what the supernal man, what the metaphysical supernal man is about. He uses the human being as an analogy, but he doesn't go full circle. He doesn't say, okay, now that you understand how these things exist in a physical person, let me explain to you how it is in the metaphysical, on the spiritual levels. He leaves that to your imagination. So he actually gives us a very, very concrete, very comprehensive, very wonderful analysis, pardon my simplification, of what it means to be human according to Kabbalah. Now, we're going to learn that tonight. That's my intent. But I want to say this at the outset. I am not going to teach this letter in order, the way it's written. I'm going to teach this letter in my own order. Now, who am I to decide that the Alter Rebbe should have written the letter different than he wrote it? I think I know why the Alter Rebbe wrote it the way he wrote it, but at the same time, I I'm going to teach it to you in a way that I feel will be more useful to us. So I'm restructuring the letter. I'm not really putting in that much information that's not in this text, although some of what I'm going to share is written in other places in Hasidus. But I am giving myself permission to restructure the class a little bit, to some extent, so that I feel I'll be able to have an easier time, certainly more efficient use of time in sharing the ideas of this particular letter. But I want to say two things that are sort of still introductory. I said to you before that what makes human beings distinctive, special, and because of this distinction we say that, quote, man is in the image of God, has two basic points. The first is a top and a middle and a bottom, Reish Toich Soif in Hebrew. And the second is a right, left, center, Yamin, Smail, Emsa. This is the idea. So let's touch on each one of these 2 points. First of all, briefly, what is the significance of saying that man is comprised of a top and a middle and a bottom? The top and the middle and the bottom in the human being would be the mind, the higher emotions, the more sophisticated emotions like love and fear and joy and sadness, and the more basic emotions, which are really more instinctive, like stubbornness and determination and commitment, emotions that are very, very deep, but not sophisticated, simple. They're emotions that you'll find even in much more elementary living things. Simpler organisms have what we call instinctive emotions. Like I told you, the neurologists and brain people call it the older part of the brain, where everything operates on a very instinctive and a very spontaneous, but very, very powerful level. In Kabbalah, this is Chabad. The intellect would be the Chabad. The higher emotions would be Chagas, and the lower emotions would be Nehi. Now, the point is that a person has a mind. The mind being higher than the heart is not just simply a location. It's a freedom. The mind being higher than the heart means that the mind, at least in theory, has the capacity to analyze and to reason without the intervention of the emotions. The emotions are biased, the emotions are extreme, the emotions are simple. You don't really feel 2 emotions at once. If it's love, it's only love. If it's hate, it's only hate. If it's frustration, it's only frustration. If it's cruelty, it's only cruelty. The mind discerns. So the mind being higher than the heart means that you have the capacity to dispersonalize, which means to depersonalize, which means to say my mind can analyze something that my heart may not like at all. My mind can entertain an idea and a position or a tendency which my heart is not comfortable with at all, because my mind is higher than my heart, not bound by that containment. And in a similar way, the higher human emotions are not compromised by the more basic human emotions. The capacity to love is actually very sophisticated. And animal behavioral students will explain to you what is required in order to be able to experience love. And of course, one of those things is time and safety and enough food. There's all kinds of evolutionary explanations for these things. But according to Torah, it's a higher soul. It's a much more sophisticated soul that can feel emotions that don't serve a direct practical purpose. Love is not automatically an action. It's an emotion. It leads to an action. But love by itself is an emotion. Those higher emotions also are above what we call the lower third of the body, where the more instinctive emotions lie, according to Kabbalah, so that our instincts, our polar tendencies, our very extreme leanings, which say, if it's good, it's very good, and if it's bad, it's very bad, do not impair, do not simplify a person and prevent them, inhibit them from experiencing what we call higher emotions. So the notion of a human being erect is a symptom of freeing up the soul. The intellectual part of the soul is free from the tendencies that the emotions would contain them with, and the higher emotions are freed from the containment that would come from the raw, from the basic emotions, from the lower third of being human. So this is a short thought about our being erect, mind, heart, and lower third of the body. I'm going to go back to this later on in great detail. The second thing I want to talk about is this concept of a right, left, and a center. It is a very simple idea, and a very important, wonderful concept to contemplate. When you divide human emotions, how many words in English denote feelings? There must be hundreds, perhaps thousands of words that denote human emotions. In Kabbalah, there's 3 emotions. There's not 6 emotions. There's not 7 emotions. There's 3 emotions. But there's 2 sets of 3. A more sophisticated set of 3 and a lower, a more base, a more crude and guttural and essential set of emotions. Why 3? And there's a very, very simple logic to it and a very important concept to get. And that is that, sure, there are all kinds of emotions. And the emotions have a tendency, they have a leaning, what we would call in politics, leaning to the right or leaning to the left. There's the far right, there's the center right, there's the left, just right of center, and so forth and so on. Right means a tendency towards kindness, towards tolerance, towards permissiveness, towards forgiveness. Left means a tendency towards strictness. I guess in politics it's backwards, but okay, that doesn't matter. This is how it is in Kabbalah. Rigidity, strictness, exactitude, and so forth and so on. So, if Kabbalah is going to start creating shades of gray, there's no limit. So Kabbalah says everything right of center is right. We call it chesed, kindness. Everything left of center is left. We call that gevura, we call that judgment, exactitude. There's extreme kindness, there's average kindness, and there's barely kind, there's extreme severity, which is cruelty, there's average severity, and there's just a little bit judgmental. The idea of there being 3 is very simple. You have a right and a left and a center. And the right includes every emotion who's leaning in the direction of kindness. The left includes every emotion who's leaning in the direction of judgment. And the center is the middle. And the philosophy here is a very simple thing. Logically, there cannot be a center. It's impossible for there to be a central emotion. Because any human emotion will have a leaning. Either it's more kind or it's more severe. Yet Kabbalah says, no, there is an emotional center. We call it Tiferet, which is translated simplistically as beauty. We'll talk about that length later on. But and Hasidus makes a very wonderful point. It says like this. Emotions are things. They're not physical things, they're emotional things. And as things, they take up space. Not physical space, emotional space. And so long as they take up space, they cannot exist in spacelessness without any space. And if they cannot exist without any space, there should not be able to be a center. The reason there's a center is because the central emotion, the middle emotion, which we call Tiferet, beauty, is inspired by something which is higher than the emotions. Okay, and I'm going to give you a very simple example, and this example is actually used in Hasidus. Okay, how much space does a corner occupy? How much space does a corner occupy? There's no such thing. Corners are not things. Walls are things. A corner is an idea. So it's either the whatever it is, the southern wall or the eastern wall, right? The western wall or the northern wall. But the corner itself is taking 2 things and using something which is not a thing, which is higher than a thing, which is human intelligence, creativity, innovation, and creating a third entity which is not a new thing. It's just exploiting the existing things to create a new concept. That's how you have to understand Tiferet. The emotion associated with Tiferet is Racham, is compassion. But any human being would automatically presume that compassion is more on the right than on the left. It's more kind than it is judgment and severe. So the word compassion, as Hasidus uses it, has to be defined. Perhaps it's different than the English concept of compassion. But the idea is very, very simply this. There is no such thing as a center in human emotions if it's the human emotions alone that are providing that center. In other words, just like walls, feelings by themselves can never have a center. It will never be exact. But when something which is above human emotions is inspired into the emotions, that can provide the center. In other words, the idea that there is an emotion which is exactly the middle is not really an emotion. It's taking from the emotion that's to the right, kindness, taking from the emotion which is to the left, which is severity and judgment, and introducing something which is above that world. And because it's above that world, it's not bound by the inexactitudes of the world, and it can create an emotional center. That's the concept of Tiferet. In other words, the central pillar of which Kabbalah speaks, which is so critically important, is very, very spiritual. All over Kabbalah and all over Hasidus, you will repeatedly encounter that the Kavam Tzoy, the middle pillar, is connected to the essence, to the truth. It's above form. It manifests in form. In other words, Tiferet is an emotion, but the emotion of Tiferet is not Tiferet. It's a little of Chesed and a little of Gevura. What makes Tiferet is something which is not an emotion at all, something which comes from the mind, and even higher than the mind, it comes from the soul. So whenever you study Kabbalah, the interesting, the compelling, the controversial, the intriguing will always be the center. Because you, on the one hand, want to explain that something exists. At the same time, this existence is really not itself. The existence is a little of this and a little of this. The manifestation of something higher into that existence explains how you have a center. So if you talk about a human being, which is what we're discussing, and we're defining the human being as having a top, middle, bottom, right, left, center, it is always the center that's going to get the most attention. It's the most difficult to explain. It's very difficult to, so to speak, pin down, but it's what makes human beings human beings. It's really the channel of the soul, of the godly soul, is the central theme, because right and left exist in animals as well. The godly soul's uniqueness is the capacity for bringing something formless into the form, non-existential into the existence, to give it this perfect center. So now let's go through them one at a time. Okay, we have 3 sets of 3. Chabad, Chagas, Nehi. The intellect, the higher emotions, and the more basic emotions. So this is how it is in Kabbalah. Chokhmah is, I call Chokhmah the creative intellectual tool. They translate it in English as wisdom, a word which is very popular and frequently used incorrectly is the word intuition. But Chokhmah is the part of the brain that's creative. And the idea that Chokhmah is a part of the brain that's creative is, Chokhmah is about humility, about recognizing that I don't know. And the humility of Chokhmah opens the person up to the subconscious. In other words, when a person recognizes their own constraints, their own limitations, and accepts them, they open themselves up to something to come from higher than their consciousness. But when ideas emerge from the subconscious to the conscious, they come as a flash, as a point, as a spark that appears and disappears. This is how people create new ideas. An idea enters into their mind. They may struggle for weeks and months, and in some cases years, and then they get a flash of insight, a flash of wisdom. So that's Chokhmah. So there's 2 parts to Chokhmah. There's the humility, there's the frustration, there's the process by which one opens themselves up to the subconscious, which is the act of Chokhmah, which is the exercise of Chokhmah. And then there's the enlightenment, there's the eureka, as they call it. There's the flash of insight which comes from the subconscious to the conscious, that's called Chokhmah. That's the right side of the brain. Bina, which means understanding, and the left side of the brain, is the exact opposite of Chokhmah. It's not creative. It's analytical, and it's thorough, and it's discerning. In other words, Bina takes a flash that comes from the subconscious to the conscious mind and opens it up, analyzes it, dissects it. In doing that, and analyzing it, and opening it up, and dissecting it, what is accomplished is, first of all, if it's flawed, you'll identify it. When you have a flash, right? Every cliche sounds good unless you study it. Every bumper sticker is cool as a bumper sticker until you start to develop it. Frequently, people get flashes of insight that's exactly what they're worth. Easy come, easy go. Bina analyzes. So Bina doesn't have the excitement, doesn't have the drama, it doesn't have the creativity of Chokhmah, but has integrity, some kind of analytical integrity. It judges. It discerns. So let's assume that a person has gotten a flash of insight which has credibility, which has meaning, which has worth, which has purpose, which has depth. So the flash of Chokhmah is exciting. The process of being, the process of understanding it, is analyzing it, is dissecting it, is opening it up, is departmentalizing it. So what do you gain and what do you lose as you go from Chokhmah to Bina? What do you gain? In other words, what's the strength and weakness of Chokhmah? What's the strength and weakness of Bina? And of course the answer is, Chokhmah is very rich, very exciting, very enlightening, but it is not thorough. You have an enlightenment, an idea enters your consciousness, your subconscious, it's very, very exciting, and that's about it. Bina is not exciting, it's not dramatic, it's not enlightened, but there's a greater honesty, there's greater analytical thoroughness. So Kabbalah says that the right side of the brain comes up with the initial creative spark, the left side of the brain analyzes, dissects, and decides what's useful and what's not useful, which directions to go, and so forth and so on. But then there's a center. And the center is called Das. Now here's what you have to understand about this center. The center of the intellectual brain, and by the way, according to Kabbalah, it's in the back of the head, the cortex they call it. Chokhmah is the right side of the brain, being the left side of the brain, Das is here. In no way does Das contribute to comprehension. In other words, when you have created a new idea and developed that idea, that means Chokhmah and Bina respectively, you will have no additional understanding when you employ Moyach HaDas. The third intellectual tool is not intellectual. In other words, it's not, I have a third tool which somehow further develops my comprehension of an idea. Not at all. The correct translation, Das means knowledge. It's a literal translation of the word. But the translation of Das, as the Alter Rebbe gives it in Tanya, is connection, hiskashus, bonding. You see, because there's a very, very important reality about the human mind. The mind has very, very little to do with the person. Now that comes as a shock to some, but it's true. You can have brilliant people who are babies, who are, from the perspective of what it means to be a human being, totally underdeveloped. And they may not even know it, and what's worse, they may not even care. The maturity, the depth, the integrity, the meaning and the worth of a human being is not how smart they are, how intelligent they are. It's how much purpose they have. That's what Das is. When I teach my teenagers about Das, I translate Das as a maturity, as a human depth. And creativity and understanding have nothing to do with depth. They have to do with intelligence. Das is that what I understand matters. That what I know should affect my practical life. If intellectually I come to the conclusion that there's a God, that means I have to make certain decisions in my practical life that should reflect that knowledge. That's not how smart I am. That's how grown up I am. That's how much maturity, how much depth, how much integrity I have. So the intellectual tool of Das actually is not intellectual at all. It's the personalization of knowledge. It's the making my ideas relevant. You know, I've told you this joke so many times that there's nothing funny about it. You know, what's the sign you're in front of a hospital? What's the answer? A whole bunch of people standing outside in white coats smoking cigarettes. It's an undeniable truth. The first time I saw it, it took me a while to realize the reason they're all standing outside is because they're not allowed to smoke in the hospital. But there's something so hypocritical about this. You know, here there are people, they're medical practitioners, their entire identity is to teach people how not to smoke, to keep them out of the hospital. Here they are, smoking cigarettes. And of course the answer is, they understand that cigarette smoke is no good. In fact, they may be able to teach it to you. They don't know. They don't know. And that's what Moyach HaDas is. The third intellectual tool is not about understanding, it's not about knowledge, it's about personalizing. And what's interesting thing is when you learn Kabbalah, you learn Hasidus, there's an expression that says, Das is the third intellectual tool. In other words, if you made a list of the 10 Sfiras, it's not even the first, it's the third. But its source is in the very deepest levels of the soul, in the very essence of the soul. You want to give him a chair? Yeah. So here you see in the first model that the center is something very, very different than the two sides. What makes, in Kabbalah and Hasidus, the difference between Kedusha and Klipa, holiness and not holiness, is the center. Because the holiness has to do with humility, bittul. And it's the humility and bittul which opens you up to God, something higher than yourself. And it is that openness to something higher than yourself that creates the possibility for this center. And in the realm of the intellect, Chochmah, Bina, Das, Chochmah, Bina are ordinary tools. Das is something very, very special. Because it's an intellectual tool. It's about the brain. It's about the mind. There's no question about that. And at the same time, it's so much deeper than the intellect. Because it's bridging two unbridgeable things. A cold, dispersonalized mind, which some would argue is nothing more than a computer, becomes human because of Maya Chadas. And that's the first set of three. Now let's move along. There's a very, very important idea brought in Hasidus, based on a pasuk that says, "Lefi sichla yohaylelish," according to one's intelligence, is their emotional expression. People express feelings, emotions, passions based on their intelligence. This means, amongst other things, the more sophisticated you are, the more sophisticated your emotions are. Children get excited about childish things. Of course, adults never do, because we're very sophisticated. We worry that the Super Bowl and the World Series is only for little kids. Adults are very sophisticated. We only concern ourselves with bigger and better things. But the Torah says, and it's a fact, the more intelligent the person is, the more sophisticated things they're going to be emotional about. Children react very quickly. Children react very extremely. Children also turn off as quickly as they turn on. Children get upset about, the mixing of French fries and rice on a plate is the reason for World War III. As we mature, hopefully, we respond emotionally to deeper things, because the intellect of a person, the strength of a person's mind, has an enormous bearing on what kind of things they're going to be emotional about. But there's two sides to this. One side of this is that adults don't react to trivial, to not such meaningful things the way children do. The flip side of it is that adult emotions are much, much deeper. When an adult does react emotionally, the emotions are incredibly strong, incredibly potent, incredibly deep, incredibly, incredibly powerful. So the emotions may not be as readily manifest, but when an adult, and the deeper the adult, the more this is true, when they get emotional about whatever issue, those emotions are incredibly intense and not easily turned off. That's the nature of being an adult. That's the pasuk. Lefi sichla yohel ish. Based on one's intelligence, this is the nature of the emotional responses that a person is going to have. Children react very quickly. They also turn off very quickly. Deeper people, more mature people, don't get as emotional as quickly, but once they experience an emotion, the emotion has incredible depth. There's a very important pasuk that says, Yosif das, Yosif machev. The greater the intellect, the more one experiences pain. Now, this is the wisdom of Shlomo HaMelech. This doesn't only mean pain. It means intensity.
Worries.
Deeper people, well, it doesn't mean worry. It can be love also. Deep love hurts. Not it hurts in a bad way. It hurts in an intense way. The more mature, the more wise, the more connected a person is, the more powerful their emotions are going to be. So they experience love deeper, they experience happiness deeper, they experience pain deeper. Everything is deeper because the mind is deeper. But which faculty of the mind contributes to this criteria? Which part of the human mind affects that if I have a bigger mind, I have a bigger heart? Not just how smart I am, but how grown up I am, how deep I am, how mature I am, how much das. A deeper person experiences feelings in a deeper way. And in my life, I think we live in an age of babies because we can afford it. You don't find very many very mature, very deep, connected people. But I will make this proposal. From my experience, Das is not necessarily a reflection of Chachma Bin. In other words, some of the deepest people I knew were not that smart. And some of the smartest people I knew were just big babies. Because there's something very different about Das. Das is a soul expression. It's an intellectual expression, but it comes from the neshama. There's people that I remember as a child who were just very, very, very deep, quiet, not very loyal, but you just saw that these were real people, deep people, They served Hashem, they were Baalei Tshuva, they served the Eibishter. You felt such an emes, such a genuineness, such a, in a weird kind of way, an intensity and a peace at the same time. That's sort of the idea, Lefi Sichli Yahil Lish. So the Alter Rebbe says that the human mind in general affects human emotion, and specifically das. The deeper, the more mature one is intellectually, the more deep and the more credible and the more lasting their emotions are going to be. Now, the emotions, like the intellect, have a right and a left and a center. Let's start. Chesed. Chesed is kindness. How do you explain kindness? Kindness is the most peripheral emotion. Kindness is the most external emotion. According to Kabbalah, the Zohar says every single emotion has kindness. Do you know that? The Zohar says, Chesed Azlam Kula Yom, every single emotion has kindness. Because kindness simply means an emotional connection. I've given you this model before, I'll repeat it. We discussed Tanya chapter 3, but it's been 3 years since Tanya chapter 3, so we can repeat it. You walk in the street, and you see a drunken bum, as some people will allow themselves to call him, who's asking for money. Kindness gives them money. Kindness says, yeah, someone needs, I give. In fact, Alter Rebbe says in Tanya, the nature of kindness is you give even those who are not in need. You give everybody. Why? There's a lot of ways of explaining it, but the psychological explanation is because human beings project. When you see deficiency, when you see weakness, when you see flaws in others, you immediately see yourself. So you want it to go away. You don't like to see suffering. Nobody likes to see suffering. Because when you're witnessing suffering, you're subconsciously associating with that suffering. So when you give it a quarter, somehow you pacify your own fears. In other words, there's something selfish about kindness. He said, it's a good thing. It's better than not being kind. Kindness is a wonderful emotion. But the instinct, the natural response of being kind is considered the most peripheral emotion, because what I'm doing when I'm being kind is not in any way thinking through the credibility or the lack thereof of my kindness. I'm just allowing my emotions to lead. My emotion says, someone looks like they need, I'm going to give them. That's what kindness is. In Kabbalah terms, kindness doesn't only mean giving. Kindness means connection. The way it says in Sfarim, you cannot hate strangers. When I was a teenager, I had Elter Bachim. You know how life works. People have an unbelievable influence on your life and they don't even know it. When I was in yeshiva, there was an Elter Bachim who was trying to get my attention, which is kind of difficult to do because I was all over the neighborhood. But he told me two things of incredible wisdom. He has no idea how much it impacted my life. How many times I've repeated them. He asked me once, what's the opposite of love? So I said hate. He said no. And he tortured me for a while, and I tried one guess, and a second guess, and a third guess, until he finally told me, the opposite of love is indifference. And it's true. Because love means a connection. You don't hate a stranger. Hate is a symptom of love. And in a weird kind of a way, it's actually more sophisticated than love. So the first emotion, the emotion on the right, is kindness. Kindness means you see someone who needs, somebody who wants, your heart says give. Then comes Gevura. Gevura is severe. Now, some people associate severity with evil. It's a big mistake. Nothing to do with the other. Severity means an emotion that actually feels the situation. Instead of reacting to the situation, try to feel the situation. Okay? Let's go back to the drunken bum on the sidewalk. Someone asks you for money. And you say to yourself, if I'm going to give this person money, he's going to go and buy himself another drink or get himself some more drugs or whatever the particular issue is. So judgment says, don't give. The emotion of judgment says, this person should not be helped in this way, because if you're helping this person in this way, you're really, in effect, punishing them. So there's actually greater sophistication to Gevura versus Chesed. Because Gevura means I am feeling that person's situation, but I'm not simply reacting to that person's situation, which is what kindness does. I'm feeling for that person's situation, I'm judging, I am determining that the emotion that this person needs right now is severity, is judgment. Now, of course, this is a bit tricky, because, like I always tell the people who don't want to give, are you going to help them, or are you just not going to give them? There's a guy in the neighborhood there, who's a drug addict. So when I don't give him $1, give him $0.25. So always a drug addict. So what are you going to do? You're going to rehabilitate him? You're going to fix him? You're not going to fix him. So what, are you just not going to give him the $0.25? Well, so who are you helping? You're helping yourself. I said, I'm not going to kill him with 25 cents. Now, this is my opinion. Okay, we're not having arguments about giving a drug addict $0.25. But someone asks, you give. Gevura is an emotion that feels that person's situation and reacts to that person's situation in terms of what it is. Or to say it in a different context, say you know who that person is. And you know that this person is in this situation because they brought it onto themselves, for example. So the emotion of Gevura judges. Judges doesn't mean mean. It just means let's get to the, so to speak, to the truth of this emotion. Sometimes Gevura says, I'm not going to give. Sometimes Gevura says, I'm going to give, but in a very contained way. What's interesting, that in Hasidus, it doesn't say in this letter, but in other places in Hasidus it says, when Gevura decides to give, it doesn't give $1. It gives $100. When judgment, which is also called strength, says the person is in need, the emotional generosity is strong. In other words, Gevura means strength. Strength sometimes means I'm going to hold myself back. I'm going to constrain myself. I'm not going to give that person because that person doesn't need it. It's not in their best interest. But when Gevura concludes that what this person needs is emotional, is help, so then the intensity of the strength of Gevura results in a far more generous gift. So chesed is a kindness. And Al says in Tanya, gives everybody, the deserving and not deserving. Gevura is a judgment, which means it judges whether it's an emotional judgment, not an intellectual. The heart feels that person's situation. And when the heart judges that this person is in need, it gives, but it gives with strength. It gives much, much more. So chesed is kindness, so to speak, is a more peripheral emotion. It's a reactionary, just giving. And Gevura is an emotion that tries to judge and to discern, to get to the bottom of a person's situation. Then you get to the center, the Tefedes. Again, we translate Tefedes as Rachman, as compassion. Okay? But before I talk about Tefedes, I just want to translate the word. The literal translation of the word Tefedes is beauty, Yossi. Beauty. And there's a very simple way of explaining it. They talk about this in chemistry and in biology, all over in everything you see this. It's called convergence. Convergence. You know, you take a triangle. A triangle is not very pretty. Yeah. But you set up 4 triangles in a square, so it has some beauty, right? And you multiply that times many, many, many arrangements, sequences. Each piece by itself is a beauty, but the collection of individual parts adds up to something which is very, very beautiful. In mystical terms, one color is never pretty. The convergence, the organization of a variety of colors is. So now, what is beautiful? If blue by itself isn't beautiful, and red by itself isn't beautiful, and purple by itself isn't beautiful, and green by itself isn't beautiful, and yellow by itself isn't beautiful, when you put them all together, what's the beauty? The beauty is not the color. The beauty is the arrangement of the colors. Those 5 colors are as benign, are as plain as they were and they are alone. The organization is, what is organization? Organization is not a color. Organization comes from the mind of an artist. That's the concept of Tefedes. The concept of Tefedes, the concept of beauty is, it's not just, a bunch of walls make a house. No. A bunch of walls organized by an intelligent person make a house. This is the same concept I told you at the outset. The 3rd pillar is distinctive because although it's an emotion, the emotions of Tefedes are chesed and gevura. There's no emotion as Tefedes. The center in terms of emotions is the depth, the neshama, the soul, the spirit that allows for emotions to have a center, to be exact, to be perfect. So one of the forms, one of the ideas which is used when we talk about Tefedes is racham, is compassion. What does compassion mean? Again, I don't know what compassion means in English, and it doesn't mean that much to me at the moment. What is the mysticism? What is the Kabbalah? What is the premise of compassion? Compassion means literally to feel what another person feels. If kindness is reactionary, and gevura, severity, is judging, racham means to feel what that person feels. It's a beautiful Rashi in Chumash. Now, by the way, this doesn't say in this again, it's Hakodesh, but this is brought in Chassidus. I've shared this with you in previous classes. There's a wonderful Rashi in Chumash. Rashi tells a story. Yishmael is dying from thirst. He's out in the desert. And the angels say to God Almighty, let him die. Why should we let him die? Because his descendants will cause the Jewish people to die from thirst. Right? The Chazal tells the story when the first base of Mikdash was destroyed. They were going into the exile and said to the Babylonians, bring us to our brothers, to the Arabs. And they brought them to the Ishmaelim, they gave them herring, and they had swollen noidos, animal skins, which usually carried water, and they were empty. So they ate all the salty food and they died from dehydration. So the Malachim say, his descendants are going to kill the Jewish nation with dehydration, let him die from dehydration. And Hashem says to the Malachim, right now, is he righteous or is he a sinner? Basher Usham, at this particular moment, Shmuel was a boy, is he righteous or is he a sinner? And the Malachim had to say he was righteous. He hadn't done any crimes, so we have to help him. Rachamim mean, the expression of the pasuk is Basher Usham, as he is now. Teferes, Rachamim means to feel another person as that person experiences themselves. That's why it's the middle pillar, because human nature doesn't allow to feel another person. Everybody has an ego. Everybody is separate. I like me. You like you. And because I like me and there's things about you which serve my purposes, I like you too. You like you, and because perhaps there's things about me that you particularly find fanciful of use, so you like me. But really, loving somebody else is the further expression of self-love. To actually feel the emotions of another human being is physically impossible. It's psychologically impossible. The human nature is the center of our universe is ourselves. But you have a soul. You have a neshama. And the level of the godly soul, you can feel another human being, because like it says in Tanya, the souls are one. So Rachamim Teferes is not simply another emotion. It's an emotion of incredible depth. The depth of Teferes is that I am feeling that person as that person feels themselves. I am judging them as they judge themselves, from their perspective, which is very, very different than Chesed, and even very, very different than Midas HaGevurah. That's Midas HaRachamim. That's the third, that's the middle pillar, middle pole. And the reason it's the middle makes complete sense, because it's not, such an emotion should not exist in as much as human beings have egos. This emotion only exists because human beings have souls. Another thing, by the way, which is associated with the middle pole, with the middle emotion, which is not brought here in Tanya, but it's brought in Tanya chapter 9, is the emotion of joy. Joy. Because what is joy? Simcha. Joy is a symptom of having, of possessing. In other words, love means I want something. Fear means I don't want to lose it. Joy means I've acquired it. So when you talk about man's relationship with God, the emotional relationship between man and God is very difficult, very deep. But there is a concept of a person loving God. Loving God simplistically means I want. Fearing God means I don't want to lose. The joy of God means I have a connection. And this is why joy is also a symptom of the middle pole, of the middle pillar, because joy expresses I've already achieved an attachment. The proof that I've already achieved an attachment is that it's expressing itself in joy. So this becomes the middle third of the human being, right? Chesed is kindness, it's reactionary. You see a person who asks, you give, your emotions say give, be kind. Gvura judges and says, no, I'm not going to give. Or if I'm going to give what the person needs, which could be quite generous. And Rachamim means I want to feel that person's situation, I'm going to react to that person's situation as it is. So I just want to mention.
Why by Gvura you don't feel the other person?
So now you have two sets of terms. Kindness, severity, beauty. Love, fear, joy. So the Alter Rebbe observes, because of love there is kindness. Because of fear there is severity. And because of joy there is beauty, or compassion. In other words, the emotions, the higher emotions have an inner aspect and an outer aspect. The inner aspect of the higher emotions are love. When you love, you're kind. When you fear, you express it in severity. Fear of being separated, express itself in self-control and things of this sort. When you experience the joy of connection, you demonstrate compassion. It's how the higher emotions work. Now let's get to the lower emotions. And again, I want to understand something. Kabbalah speaks about 7 emotions. That's how this letter actually begins, with 7 emotions. But it's not 7. It's 3, 3, and 1. So we just discussed the first set of features of the higher emotions, the more sophisticated emotions, which exist, primarily by human beings and very, very, very sophisticated animals, where you can experience emotion that's not necessarily a practical thing. Your mind understands, so your heart feels. Then you have lower emotions. The lower emotions are very guttural, very raw, very essential. They come from the deepest place in every living thing. And like I said to you, this is sort of the level of emotions that we would call instinct, or what they call it in psychology, fight or flee, just the reaction, the response. They're very powerful. They're the strongest expressions of being a human being, but they're very, very simple. And of course, the two are interconnected. The more sophisticated something is, the more subtle, the more nuanced it will be. And the less, I always give an example. What's better, 5 fingers or a fist? Right? Fingers can draw beautiful pictures. A fist can smash through a window. Raw power exists in a fist. That's nihi. More sophisticated, higher expressions are more subtle, and they're more complex. So the lower third of the person is the most basic level of the human being. And here too you have a right and a left and a center. The first is Netzach. There are as many translations for Netzach as there are people who think they know what they're talking about. Mine is determination. Netzach is determination. Stick-to-itedness, as some would call it. Determination is an emotion that has a toughness, a fight, and you will not dissuade me kind of tendency. When a person's victory, it's the literal translation when it means victory. And of course it doesn't mean victory, it means the desire for victory, the want for victory. When a person expresses midas hanetzach, there's a determination. And in my visual, netzach means a person who says, I will walk through a mountain if I have to. You are not going to stand in my way. It's strong, it's single-minded, and it's not going to be dissuaded. And listen, in reality, you have a good idea, yeah? You're very excited about that idea, yeah? If you are going to see it through, if you're going to actually successfully do something, it's not because you're smart, not because you're excited, but because you're determined. Successful people are the people with the great ideas. Successful people are the people who can carry those ideas through. That's what netzach is. Netzach is an emotion. It's considered part of the right side of the person because it's an aggressive emotion. It's an emotion that reaches out, that extends itself. But it's an incredible determination to fight with every obstacle. So the Alter Rebbe says, what kind of obstacles do we have? Basically 2 types of obstacles. Obstacles from outside of ourselves and obstacles from within ourselves. The human being's nature is that we constantly doubt. And if you want to see something through, you cannot afford to doubt. You have to fight. You have to see it through to the bitter end. That's what Midas HaNetzach is. Midas HaNetzach is the determination to see something through. If somebody stands in my way, I will run him over. And part of that is a determination that is directed at yourself. In other words, when you find yourself losing your will to see something through, what carries you through when you're not so excited, you have an idea. Yeah, an idea. I want to start a business. This idea came from the mind, we hope. That would be a bad idea. Then after the idea was in the mind, then you developed it in your emotions. You were very excited about it. And then you want to make it happen. You're not always so excited about it. Frequently you question yourself, you second-guess yourself. Once you make the decision to commit, what carries you through is the lower emotions. And netzach means determination, a fight. And I will fight with myself, I'll fight with my own weaknesses. And netzach also means I'm going to fight with anything outside of me that's going to try and interfere with me. I'm going to fight and see it through. It's midas hanetzach. The other side is midas hahoid. Now what happens is that there's some lines missing in the text. That was the original letter of the Alter Rebbe, which was published after he passed away, was missing a few lines. But Chassidus talks about midas hahoid. This is my own definition. Hoid, in my translation, means stubbornness. Stubbornness. hard-headedness. It's translated sometimes as commitment, as loyalty. But at the heart of the commitment, or the committedness, is a stubbornness. Midas Ahoid means you cannot move me. I'm not going to fight with you. I'm not going to engage. I'm just going to stand my ground. And the reason Midas Ahoid is associated with the left side, because it's the opposite of an expressive emotion. Just like Chesed, Netzach reaches out. The right side represents giving. Hoid is not giving, it's hunkering down. If Midas HaNetzach fights with every obstacle, Hoid just doesn't allow any obstacle to get to it. It's just so stubborn, so committed, so obstinate, so headstrong in its commitment to what it's committed to, that nothing in the world can budge it. It's Midas HaHoid. It's an akshonis, it's a stubbornness. And of course, in the real world, if you're going to succeed, you need a considerable measure of that too. Just make sure that your stubbornness doesn't end up having you pounding your head into a stone wall for no particular purpose. So that's the left. And again, the similarity between the right side and Netzach and the left side and Hoid is because the right side in general is the idea of chesed, of giving, and Netzach is an aggressive emotion. The left side is more of containment, and Hoid is a contained emotion. It's an emotion of stubbornness and self-control. Then comes Yosod. The translation of the word Yosod means foundation. It's the emotional foundation of a human being. And it's our center. And like I explained to you in the introduction to the class, the center is always the deepest and the most sophisticated emotion. Midas HaYesod means connection, attachedness. The connection between two people has with Midas HaYesod. He gives a bunch of examples. A teacher teaches students, he has to feel the connection to students, otherwise he cannot teach. A father communicates with his son. If there's no deeper connection, the connection. A husband has a relationship with a wife. Yesod is about that. The place of connection, the place where they meet, is the strength of their bond. Yesod. And what's so profound of Midas HaYesod, and again, it's not so explicitly articulated this again as Hakodesh, but I'm going to explain it to you as I see it. You see, you want to accomplish something. You want to start a business, for example. So your business is not going to happen because you're a smart guy. Your business is not going to happen because you're an emotional person. Your business is going to happen because you're a determined person. Midas HaNetzach fights. Midas HaHoid hunkers down. Midas HaYesod connects. If I had to put it in words, I would say it this way. Determination comes from the person. Stubbornness comes from the person. Yesod comes from the thing you're connected to. In other words, if you are building a business, Midas HaYesod means I am drawing energy from the business itself. In other words, if you are connected to another human being, Midas HaNetzach is the strength that you invest in that relationship. Midas HaHoid is the strength that you invest in the relationship. Midas HaYesod is the relationship itself. And that again explains why Yesod is the center, because the Yesod is a practical emotion. It's an emotion, it's the ultimate stick-to-itiveness. It's the ultimate commitment, loyalty, seeing something through. But the emotion is not coming from me. It's coming from the connection itself. In other words, it's not I'm investing in the relationship. It's the relationship itself. The thing that you are connected to is the source of the power of the project that you wish to accomplish. So if you undertake to start a business, Netzach means I'm going to fight with everybody to build the business. Hoid would mean I'm going to be stubborn and not let anybody dissuade me to build the business. Yesod means I'm going to draw strength from the business itself to see this project through. That's Midas HaYesod. It's the deepest emotion. It's connection. It's loyalty. It's bondedness, if you will. So there you have it. That is how Kabbalah defines the human being. He says we have 3 tiers, 3 layers. Animals don't have 3 layers. Some animals have 2. In other words, you have animals with higher emotions. No animals have 3. The 3 layers is the objective, cold, dispersonal mind. And at its heart is das, that can make the disconnected connected. Then there's the higher emotions, and the deeper emotion is the feres, joy, compassion. And the lower emotions, which of course all living, all whatever mammals have, is emotions that have to do with survival, The center of that is Midas HaYesod. Now, everything that I just described is discussed here in this letter. I've embellished. If I didn't say I embellished, I'd be a liar. But I have given you an overview of the design and the model of a person that's basic. The Alter Rebbe then repeats the very same discussion a second time. In other words, everything that I just told you takes a page, a folio, 2 sides of a sheet. After the Alter Rebbe provides us essentially with the information I just shared, he repeats the whole thing a second time. The second version of it is not very different than the first, except that in the second version he talks about what we call the godly soul. In other words, everything we just described is true in any human soul. The godly soul, the animal soul, the intellectual soul. He says, I want to repeat this now in as much as the godly soul is concerned. And as far as the godly soul is concerned, he's going to discuss Chochmah Bina Das on the level of the godly soul, Chesed Gevurah Tiferes on the level of the godly soul, Netzach HaYesod on the level, but the godly soul is only one interest. Godliness. Higher things. I don't know if you can remember as far back as the beginning of the Tanya. We had a conversation. What's the difference between the godly soul and the animal soul? And one of the differences is the animal soul is not interested. He's simply not interested in what is beyond. You talk to the animal soul about heaven and afterlife and purpose, and the animal soul doesn't say, I don't agree. The animal soul doesn't I don't understand. The animal soul says, I can't eat it. It's interested only in the here and now, only in the actual physical universe, not where it came from and why it exists and where it's going. And the godly soul is only interested in the transcendent. The godly soul says, forget about food. Forget about clothing. Forget about the physical world. What is it all about? What is its soul? What is its higher purpose? What is its purpose? What is its point? What is its transcendence? So the Alter Rebbe repeats the entire conversation, again, employing the godly soul into the discourse. We're going to do this next week, Yossi. Next week we'll go over this whole thing and talk about the godly soul. And you'll see the differences between the animal soul and the godly soul. And it's very God-centric. It's very religious. It talks about Hashem, feelings for God, studying God, and so forth and so on. And there's some also very creative new ideas which we haven't had at all. But there's one thing that I do want to say, although the Alter Rebbe doesn't mention it. It's very interesting. This discussion begins with a statement. Man has 7 emotions. That's where he starts. What are the 7 emotions? The 3 higher emotions, the 3 lower emotions, and Malchus. In his first version of it, he speaks about the 3 higher emotions, he speaks about the 3 lower emotions, but doesn't discuss Malchus. When he repeats it, in the godly soul, he says the 3 higher emotions, the 3 lower emotions, and Malchus. But I'm very bad at suspense. It's one of those things that I'm not very good at. So I'm just going to explain to you. Malchus, which is considered the 7th emotion, really means action, practice, doing. There's the higher emotions, the lower emotions is how you feel about these things, or how you're going to get these things done. Malchus does it. Or if you are insistent on giving it a psychological label, Malchus is being able to accept. You're doing it without any feelings because it needs to get done. Not higher emotions, not lower emotions, acceptance. That's Malchus. And it's the end of being human. The end, in other words, a human being is not comprised of 9 parts, a human being is comprised of 10. And next week, I intend to elaborate on it. Why is the end of being human the 10th aspect, which is getting things done? Because it's a very, very simple thing. If you don't get things done, how do I say this gently? You're a failure. Doesn't matter how spiritual you are, how sophisticated you are, how enlightened you are, and how religious you are. It's a real world. And we live in it. And Tanya spends so much time saying, what we do matters more than anything else. And it's not just what we do matters more than anything else, is because that's what changes the world. Because it's the ultimate sign of the integrity of our inner self. The proof that we're truly intelligent, the proof that we truly feel, the proof that we're truly determined is that we do. And if we have everything in order, and when it comes to the bottom line we don't deliver, it's a reflection of an inner deficiency. In other words, it's not just I'm missing the capacity to do things, there's something on hold about my soul, about my spirit, about my inner self. And the proof is I don't see things through. And that's why so much of Chassidus talks about action being the main thing, bringing God into the lowest world. In Kabbalah, Malchus is called Shulamis, or Shulamis. It's a beautiful name, Shulamis. Shulamis means to make whole. The sign that we're whole is that not only that we're sophisticated, but that we're practical. And Mitzvah next week, we will do it again.
Motivation would be on the lowest level? And
No. Motivation would be on the middle level.
And the basis for the motivation would be what would be selfishness.
Depends what you're doing. To a great...
So selfishness is on the lowest level, right? So it's the best, right?
Okay, wait.
Because it's all goes towards yourself.
Selfishness is universal. We are selfish people, period. The Tanya says something, a Hakodesh, a radical thing. The godly soul is selfless. Okay, but that psychologists would argue that. In the world of psychology, the very, very presumption in all of the study of mental health and the human psyche is you always have to find how it's leading back to you. How I'm going to gain. Torah says the neshama has a capacity for selflessness, for doing things truly altruistically, no reciprocity, no return, no gain. But the animal within the human being, as sophisticated as he may be, the center of itself is self. So you cannot put selfishness in any place. Selfishness is what the animal is. Okay? All dimensions of the human being are selfishness. The ultimate motivation for everything is selfishness. But you see, we are quite sophisticated. The core of the human being is self. But we're not animals. In other words, self could be quite sophisticated. Like, for example, in the world in which we live right now, we have made kindness, charity, into a selfish act. Now, is that good or bad? It's certainly better than most of history. So the fundamental truth is a selfish one. But the evolution, the form, is very, very sophisticated. So when you say motivation, the idea that a human being is motivated by selfishness is beyond this entire discussion. It goes to the very essence. But here's how we would break it down. You are motivated by your emotions. You are motivated by your heart. You are successful. You see things through because of your lower emotion, because of your determination. You would like to believe that your emotional motivation comes from principle, comes from ideas. In other words, your brain thinks objectively. Your brain thinks openly. Your brain thinks honestly. And says, this is what I should feel. And because this is what I'm going to feel, this is what I'm going to do. And if I'm going to do it successfully, I'm going to be determined. So, in a way, this entire class is a class about motivation. The motivation begins with a good idea. It's followed up with a deep emotion. And it's graduated with a practical emotion, with an emotion that just makes it happen. And you understand how the real world works. When the ideas are brought into the real world, they tend to become less exact. And then you get into the realm of, if it's not perfect, how good is good enough? The reality of the world, it's impossible to do good without hurting somebody. I told this to you before class. If you never want to feel any pain, don't do any goodness. That's how it is. Goodness, making the world a better place, getting involved is not perfect because the world isn't perfect. And as human beings, that's what life is about. Life is not just having good ideas. Life is seeing those good ideas through and trying to make them work in a way that even if it's not perfect, it's still more good than bad. It's still justified. It's still right in the real world.